Hello there. What I'm about to show you is horrifying, shocking, and will be very bad for your blood pressure too. And it's all hidden in plain sight. Only a cursory glance at social media and many newspaper comment sections, where they're still allowed, will tell you that there is mounting concern in the UK about the increased levels of inward migration and the effect it is having on our society. But all we're bombarded with by the woke left establishment and its lackey press is that there is nothing legitimate about any concerns ordinary people have on this issue. And recently someone appeared in court where part of the allegation was that they posted anti-establishment rhetoric online. And the report must be true because it came from the BBC. Think about that for a moment. That this even appears as a phrase in a court case should send shivers down your spine. And when you give it a few seconds thought, you suddenly realise that what we used to call immigration was generally in the tens of thousands a year. But we're now in the hundreds of thousands a year, trending upwards. We now need a completely different word for it. But it must not be questioned or criticised in any shape or form by the mere proletariat. In fact, dissent on the issue must be comprehensively crushed, to the point of emptying the prisons of serial offenders and other dangers to society to replace them in the cells with members of the far right receiving long and harsh sentences, some of whom would in the past have received a slap on the wrist at most. And this is the response that the establishment requires of us. Of you. And I do have to ask how many people out there, like me, suspect that the recent flurry of locking up eco-loons for lengthy periods was the start of legitimising long sentences against anyone who failed to toe the establishment line. Whatever that line was, a constantly moving line at that. Just a question. Now you may not know, but a UK delegation had to front up at the United Nations, yesterday I think it was, in order to stand before a committee and explain exactly what they were doing about what the UN calls these racist riots in the UK. Yes, that is exactly the terminology the UN is using. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the CERD, met and noted the state authorities' swift response to investigate recent racist riots. And the head of the UK delegation to the UN on this, someone called Elizabeth Mary Hawkins, Deputy Director of Communities, Governance and Institutions, Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, said, "The United Kingdom was committed to building a fairer country and taking action to address racial inequality. It was encouraging people to be proud of their racial identity. It was working with its partners to address racial discrimination across all its territory." Encouraging people to be proud of their racial identity. While the establishment they really represent, the uniparty blob, denigrates the culture and the heritage of this country as well as the flags of the UK and England. How dare they? How dare they claim that we are encouraged to be proud of our racial identity? Nothing could be further from the truth. The very fact that these kind of statements can be so easily trotted out to these unaccountable star chambers beggars belief. And no, I have no idea who Elizabeth Mary Hawkins is, nor those who sit on the UN committees. And I definitely do not remember electing any of them. But nowhere could I find any mention of any legitimate concerns about the level and speed of inward migration that the long-suffering and overly tolerant people of the UK might have. Nothing. The whole meeting seems to have been conducted on the basis that all migration must always be considered a boon to the receiving nation, every single one of them. In fact, it was all about the racist rioters being on the end of the full force of the law. No talk about slowing down and easing pressures, no hint of that, no. It has all the hallmarks of a despotic regime reporting to a global supporter of despotic regimes and saying we'll be more despotic in future. And there you have it. Minority interests rule in the UK and no one can ever argue. Now I'll ask the question, who do you think the likes of our grand and illustrious leader Keir Starmer are listening to? The spouting of UN committees and the WEF, or the people who vote and pay tax in the UK? Silly bloody question, isn't it? Who's actually in charge of this nation, the voters or some shadowy political elite? Another silly bloody question. We're all being barked at continually. Starmer, just like the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper and the Foreign Secretary David Lammy, have to jet about the world, meeting the wealthy and powerful, the great and good. And it is these people that our ministers are out to please, for all but the 4 weeks leading up to an election, of course. Also, in any other context, the heavy-handed use of the police and courts to deal with any other sort of riot would probably be roundly condemned somewhere in the United Nations. Actually, they did have a bit of a moan earlier this year. From The Guardian in January. A severe crackdown on environmental protest in Britain with draconian new laws, excessive restrictions on courtroom evidence and the use of civil injunctions is having a chilling impact on fundamental freedoms, the United Nations Special Rapporteur has said. Yes, the eco-loons must be allowed to disrupt our lives at will. And in July 2020, Liberty Human Rights wrote, overbearing and discriminatory policing during the coronavirus lockdown in conjunction with Black Lives Matter protests has put UK policing in the spotlight. And the Standard had reported a month earlier, riot police have clashed with hundreds of protesters on Whitehall as the Black Lives Matter protests over George Floyd's death become heated. So yesterday's overbearing riot policing becomes today's justified crackdown. All that matters is which side you are on. Therefore, two-tier appears to be a very apt descriptor of where we're at. But what should worry us all is the totally oppressive way in which the concerns of the silent and silenced majority are not just ignored but censored and stifled by the legal system. It seems now that you are far more likely to get a physical police presence at the door after making a hurty social media comment online than you are for shoplifting, or if you are the victim of a crime like burglary, for example. But we are all no longer able to voice concerns about the way our society is changing, especially if the outcome would reveal the source of our troubles. Our vote carries ever-diminishing weight. No wonder more and more people shun the ballot box. And remember, as I pointed out at the start, anti-establishment rhetoric has now been added to the criminal lexicon. How long now before any protest deemed anti-establishment is banned? How long before anti-establishment voting becomes problematic? We've all read about this sort of thing in the history classes. We are on a very, very slippery slope indeed.